So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rowan Dorn. I'm one of the core faculty members of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. Thank you, Charlotte, and the rest of the cheering gallery. And it is my great joy today to welcome on behalf of the Taube Center, as well as our co-sponsors, the History Department, the Center for Medieval Early Modern Studies, the Department of Religious Studies, and the Program in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, today's speaker, Deena Aranoff of the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Professor Aranoff, even more wonderfully for us, is this year's David S. Lobel Visiting Scholar in Jewish Studies at the Taube Center. And in that capacity, not only is she speaking to us here today, but for those of you who are able to register for such things, she will be teaching a class this winter on the Hebrew Bible, Jewish Studies 116, cross-listed Religious Studies, Religious Studies 116X. Professor Aranoff's work is sort of very broad-ranging, even by the sort of classically broad-ranging standards of Jewish studies. In a single article, it will run from Deuteronomy to Onsky and beyond, with many stops sort of along the way. There's a through line in much of her work that I have found particularly fascinating, which is the interplay of language and culture, and particularly of Jewish language and Jewish languages and Jewish culture, and the way that these sort of come together and intersect, particularly in the early modern period, but really from the very beginnings of Jewish culture to the present. More recently, her work has moved in a new direction, thinking about motherhood, childhood, other aspects of family life, though even here, as I suspect will come out today, language remains sort of a guiding concern, or at least a central element of her investigations. So it is with great delight that I introduce our visitor, my visiting colleague, Professor Aranoff, to speak to us today about mother's milk, child rearing, household, and the making of Jewish culture. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Wow. Thank you for those words of welcome. It feels very good to be here, to see old friends, old faces, new faces, graduate students, undergraduates, friends of this campus and beyond. It's very nice to be here. Thank you to Shana Hammerman, Charlotte von Robert, and Steve Zipperstein for the honor of this invitation and for your collegial support over these past many years. Thank you to Eva, who coordinated this program and brought us this wonderful lunch. A critical role that is played always by the operations of a program such as this. I was admitting to Shana that as I was preparing my lecture for today, I spent probably an undue amount of time just on my initial words of introduction because of the times that we're living in. And so I made what is probably, you'll see, you know, that mistake of spending endless amounts of time on the first page or two of something. Leaving the rest in a slightly less finished state. But this is the state that we're in right now, isn't it? These are very dark days. We know that this is undeniably so. Before our very eyes, we are witnessing the crumbling of what we would have liked to consider basic standards of human behavior, basic regard for the humanity of others. And no matter where we cast our gaze, we witness everywhere the erosion of nonviolent means of social and political change. I won't name, you know, the atrocities of this moment. I will only say that the cries of those murdered on October 7th and of those who are still in captivity are ringing in our ears. It will forever torment us. And the cries of Palestinian civilians facing aerial bombardment without shelter and without basic provisions are ringing in our ears. It is deafening. Al eile ani bochia. For these I'm crying, and I am crying. And when we lift our gaze beyond the violence that is unfolding in Israel-Palestine, we know that, and I'm sorry to be dark for a moment, but we know that the human capacity for collaboration and for communication is at risk more broadly, globally. We see it in our failure to collaborate on challenges that are facing us all, the degradation of the natural world upon which we rely for our basic sustenance, the inequities in resource allocation that places fatal and unspeakable burdens on the populations residing outside the industrial West, the failure of care systems worldwide, be they systems of family, of schooling, childcare, medical and social provisions, the continued use of crude violence in conflict over resources, nations continuing to mobilize against one another based on propagandistic notions of one another, bringing immeasurable harm to all involved. It is all a tragedy. These are the times. And I particularly look out at those of you here in this room, undergraduates. I feel that I'm in that position now in life where I feel I owe an apology to the young people growing up right now in a world so poorly equipped to wrestle with the challenges that are facing all of us. And what is the place of academic inquiry in this dark chapter? I'm sure each of you in your own way wake up each morning and wonder about your own role that you might play. And if you're affiliated with the university, you're in that place of information production, systems of thinking. Is there some way that we can perhaps shift a perspective or provide a possibility of communication that looks closed off? You know, that's the possibility of maybe opening something up. I hope that my talk today might open up a little bit of a window into an understanding of the human condition that can bring us a little closer together. The title of the talk is Mother's Milk, Child-Rearing, the Household, and the Making of Jewish Culture. So what is this mother's milk perspective? Well, I would, and my own, I guess you could say, activism as an academic. If there is an activist component to my scholarship, I think I would call it care activism. And that is, I am hoping that my scholarship contributes to the effort to increase our awareness of the critical role of maternal care and household and family relations in the making of a person, in the making of a culture, and in the making of religion. And we are certainly at a point in human history in which the forgetting of this relationship, the forgetting of this first phase of life and all of its milky interdependence, the favoring that we have seen, the favoring of the later phases of development, the delightful sensations of autonomy, individuation, that kind of favoring, I think, has run its course. And it really is time, I think, to pivot and to reckon with the web of relations, human and natural, that sustain us, and from which our patterns of self and belonging emerge. And I think there is much promise in this reckoning. I think that if we retrieve awareness of the mother, and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean about the mother, if we retrieve awareness of the mother, and along with the mother, all of those constant matters upon which we rely, we may then be more equipped to direct our collective actions towards the efforts that sustain our collective well-being. It's like a movement towards life. The central claim of my study, and that I will kind of move through in today's lecture, is as follows. Here's the claim. The maternal relation and the household context more broadly is a central node in the making of Jewish culture over time. Child rearing is undoubtedly the procedure by means of which a child survives. I mean, you just think for one moment and you realize that a child survives only by virtue of somebody else who is charged with the task of constant provisions. To expose a child is to kill a child. To be with a child is to be able to then provide life for the child. So this child rearing is a universal necessity. It is also the selfsame procedure by which a child is initiated into cultural and linguistic patterns that will then organize their behavior lifelong. In other words, there is no child rearing in the abstract. That's kind of been a drumbeat for me in my project as I've thought this through over the years, that child rearing is a universal necessity. For a human infant to survive, it requires care and responsiveness, but it is actualized in entirely culturally specific ways. We all eat food, humans on this planet, and we all eat food differently. We speak differently. We require others in our life to survive, but the provisions are actualized in culturally specific ways. And so household relations, in particular the maternal relation, forms the key context within which an entire repertoire of culturally constituted behaviors, both of the individual and of the collective, are forged. My emphasis upon family relations and the household as a major node in the making of Jewish culture suggests that we revise a shorthand that is more typically found in the telling of the history of the Jews. And perhaps some of you are familiar with this shorthand, and that is the use of the twin settings of the temple, the ancient temple of Jerusalem, and the synagogue as the shorthand for major developments in Jewish history. These settings, along with their personification in, let's say, priest, the Kohen of the Beit Mikdash, and then the rabbi of the Talmud, these settings often, they function almost as metonyms for the entirety of the Jewish landscape. Symbols of everything that sort of matters culturally in the history of the Jews. They also serve to mark Jewish time. The temporal schema that's suggested would be something like ancient temple times, and then the rise of the rabbinic alternative. So these settings have a kind of they're shorthand for temporal kind of divisions in Jewish history. They're also shorthand for content and significant content. I propose that we add a third node to this shorthand. Let us add the household. And I'm, sitting in the room here with Charlotta, who's thinking about Jewish spatiality, has been so influential for me in even beginning to think about settings and place in Jewish history. And Charlotta has introduced the word neighborhood in a similar way to kind of open up the material aspects, especially of diaspora formations, but not only, in thinking about the Jewish landscape beyond just these ivory tower settings, say, of temple and synagogue. I'm proposing that we add household, and then I'm kind of, I guess, somewhat playfully suggesting that the personified metonym there would be mother. If you add the household to these spatial distillations of Jewish culture, it actually addresses a mystery that I think has kind of resided in the history of the Jews for a very long time. The mystery is something like, what accounts for the persistence of Jewish cultural forms and affiliations, given the conditions of rupture, persecution, migration? It's simply astounding to think about the continuities in Jewish culture. That's not to say that it's kind of monolithic or fixed, but how is it that there is this longue durée, given the fact that these chief settings, temple and even synagogue to some extent, have themselves experienced such a history of disruption, of rupture? And what I'm suggesting is that the distinction between household activity and religious activity is what has kind of taken away from scholars the means by which they could, in a way, dare I say it, easily account for the vitality of Jewish culture in periods of radical change and instability. The inclusion of the household as a premier site in the making of Jewish culture provides just such an account. And I will share that for whatever reason, the verse that has come to mind again and again as I think about adding the household to these spatial distillations of Jewish culture is the verse from Kohelet, from Ecclesiastes, Hachut HaMeshulash Lo Bimhera Yinatek. The trifold, the threefold cord is not easily broken. It's like the more reduced ivory tower narrative that, like I said, creates lots of problems, lots of mystery. Maybe the aura of mystery is appealing to some people, but I understand why it becomes very mysterious, how it is that despite the ruptures, nevertheless there's some kind of continuity. But when you add the third piece, it's just, there's a certain strength to the cultural fabric that is now accounted for. And I should say again that the cultural aspects of household life, Jewish cultural aspects, do not persist unchanged. Consider, for example, the many Jewish languages to have emerged throughout the centuries and contexts of diaspora, foods, styles. I always joke, there really is no such thing as Jewish food. It is very culturally and contextually specific. I sometimes joke that it's possible that a defining characteristic of Jewish food and maybe Jewish language is that it came from somewhere else. That might be the only thing, but there are sociolinguists who could say that much better. So I do not contend that a set of static cultural constants have been mechanically reproduced in the household. Quite the contrary. The household serves as a context within which Jewish cultural forms are performed and altered, always in relation to circumstance and tradition. Jewish cultural elements are generated and transformed in the household, the street, the kitchen, and in its many vernacular modalities, the neighborhood. These elements are not fixed constants, but a constantly adjusting set of behaviors. So my approach really assumes these two complementary critical perspectives. On the one hand, I'm talking about something universal in the need for care and the necessary presence of another person, and ideally persons, for a human infant to survive and thrive. Two, the cultural specificity with which that procedure is actualized. And the title, Mother's Milk, I'm hoping really evokes both of those aspects. Mother's milk as an idiom refers to knowledge that's acquired in a primary way. People will say, oh, you know, that person acquired that know-how like with their mother's milk. What does that mean? Well, it's this primary way that the know-how was absorbed. Like, usually the implication is nonverbal, mimetic mechanisms of transmission. Things learned early in life, so fully absorbed as to become a part of the person, like the stuff of milk that miraculously, beautifully becomes the cells of the infant body. And so I evoke both meanings of the phrase, the elemental sense of breast milk, so the sustenance that is necessary for any living creature to survive, as well as its metaphoric extension. When you hear people use the phrase mother's milk, they refer to the stuff that's transmitted early in life and that takes up a very firm and almost fixed place in the person. And I want to suggest that these two senses are actually inseparable. The mother's milk is itself not a universal provision of sustenance. That's only later mixed with cultural specificity. Feeding the child is a cultural act from the start. And that's kind of been, as I said, my guiding refrain, that there's no such thing as child rearing in the abstract. There's no natural, unmarked activity of rearing a child. There are only the particular behaviors, sensibilities, relational and linguistic enactments that comprise this first and critical phase of human development. Similarly, there is no such thing as a child in the abstract. There is only the socially constituted person in whom the elements of nature and culture are indistinguishable. This is Elizabeth Gross is the thinker who, it's already decades ago now, kind of helped to theorize the body as itself a kind of cultural artifact, not something that unfolds in kind of predetermined biological trajectories, though there is a bio aspect to human development, but that it's really best understood as really a marked body, marked by social and cultural context. There's no wild child raised by wolves and from whose mouth pours an elemental Hebrew or some imagined neutral language. There is only the particular inscribed person formed in relation to their earliest environment. The young child is not wrapped in a platonic form of universal care, but with the specific cultural coordinates of time and place, along with elements of language, affect, and sensibility. These formations take shape in relation to those charged with the task of regular care. And as you'll come to see in just a moment, that's really my definition of maternal. The maternal relation is the constant relation. That person or persons charged with the task of constant responsiveness to the needs and communications of the infant. It need not be a biologically determined relation. It need not be a woman. But it is that feature of constancy, which I'll talk about a little bit in the moment, that it's possible that actually the Hebrew language preserves some of that, in that the word for faithfulness or regularity or constancy, aleph mem nun, emunah, ne'eman, I'm kind of getting to my end before I've even gone through, but that the aim, the maternal aspect, might actually be embedded in that term for faithfulness as the kind of initial concrete relation from which more abstract notions of regularity, faithfulness, and steadfast support could be derived. So I'm really emphasizing the maternal relationship in a functional sense, that is, as a representation of the relations and context that sustain a child, which you could say, well, then why use mother or maternal at all? And I was thinking about that. My friend and colleague, Nomi Seidman, was talking to me about, she's being asked, what's your key word? Key word is like a new thing in academia, books that are organized, book series about keywords, and, maybe it's a good thing. Scholars are being asked, what's your word? What's your topic? And so I felt like, I guess, is my key word mother? I could also easily say household, because I'm really much more interested, again, in this broader context and set of relationships. I actually think it's a kind of difficulty of modern parenting that one can even imagine a child being raised in a dyadic, exclusively dyadic relation mother-child. And it's really meant to be a the child embedded in a broader set of relationships. So I'm afraid to reify mother and this notion of the isolated mother as this kind of universal and pan-historical reality, when in fact the isolated mother of the modern industrial context is the departure from the norm. But I use the word mother anyway, and that's because of the biological, social, and cultural realities that continue to place mothers and women at the center of the task of child rearing. And I'm drawing here on Mara Benjamin's work, who has, in very beautiful ways, theorized also the maternal relation and the obligation that characterizes that relationship. Mara, when talking about this very question, argues that it is appropriate to emphasize the mother when talking about child rearing, since, and here I'm quoting Benjamin, children, at least in their early years, are primarily cared for by women, mothers and others, end quote, and that, and here's a continued quote, for many or perhaps most people, child rearing remains differentiated along gendered lines, and caring for children is coded as female, end quote. So I felt that to drop the term mother in favor of a more neutral term like household would cover up the very social relationships that I'm seeking to retrieve. As Adrienne Rich, you could say Adrienne Rich, she's like the founding figure of this entire enterprise, also decades ago, she said it as follows, quote, "For most of us, a woman provided the continuity and stability, but also the rejections and refusals of our early lives. And it is with a woman's hands, eyes, body, voice that we associate our primal sensations, our earliest social experience." End quote. And so I retain the key word mother, even as I then define it as a figure that represents the broader context of the household relations and operations within which the child becomes who they will become as a person in the culturally specific sense. And this is not a new insight either, and I'm seeing people nod. There is a common sense aspect to what I'm sharing today. I mean, so Clifford Geertz, you know, classic anthropologist, he noted decades ago that unlike other animals and mammals that are born with many of their faculties in full swing, they rely on a very brief and sometimes not critical phase of relating to the birthing figure. Human beings, in contrast, must learn even their most basic operations. In that sense, we're kind of born premature. And then the all-consuming activity of the infant is learning. This is those of anyone who's dabbled in some of the thinking of Moshe Feldenkrais, the body worker and body theorist who's he died in the 1980s, but he gave a lot of thought to the centrality of learning for the human species in particular. That learning takes the place of what is already genetically coded in many other animal species. And what that means is that it's an extremely important aspect of being human is the phase of learning, and in particular the phase of learning in the first months and years of life. Everything else that happens after that, it's like, yeah, like what happens here at the university. Feldenkrais has a comment on that. He's like, oh yes, academic learning, here's his definition. You can do it or not do it. That's his definition of academic learning. This sort of learning for becoming a person, it's not only not optional, it's critical. Feldenkrais has very beautiful interventions to assist in reawakening that process of learning. So that's the delight in dabbling in Feldenkrais, is you can carry on with that process and acquire new patterns of movement. So these habits are formed in early childhood, a whole repertoire of behaviors and sensibilities. And you know, Pierre Bourdieu, also a sociolinguistic theorist, he brought to us this term habitus, It was a bit in circulation before him, but it's most well known as he presented it. For Bourdieu, the habitus is the schema of perception, thought, and action that are internalized by the individual and that guarantee the stability of broader social formations. For Bourdieu, the inculcation of habitus ensures the constancy of practices, also the transmission of past experiences, quote, more reliably than all formal rules and explicit norms. Bourdieu did not emphasize maternal care in his writings, yet his comments assume the acquisition of habitus very early in life. The intensive social engagement that is necessary for an infant to survive is the very same process by which the cultivation of habitus, or to use Geertz's term, the cultural finishing of the human being takes place. And so the mother not only provides the infant with basic needs, but fosters the equally significant schema of perception and expression that are essential for human function. The household is the key site in the forging of these attitudes and activities, a key site in which varieties of the Jewish habitus are forged, a key site in the making of religion. What do I mean by religion? And I'm sure there are people in this room could offer even more astute definitions, but I will just share with you the definition I've been working with. I use the term religion in the fullest sense, not as a discrete category of human experience, but as an organizing framework for everyday life, a set of attitudes and sensibilities acquired by a person by means of regular actions and cultural practices. Religion, according to this definition, provides a person with the most basic orientation to time and place, rhythms of activity, assembly, speech, movement. Cultural anthropologist Talal Asad proposed that we consider religion in precisely this sense, a set of attitudes and social relationships, as opposed to a set of doctrines or beliefs that are espoused through rational and volitional inquiry. For Assad, religion is the enactment of a set of culturally inflected practices rather than an imposed or even coerced set of performances or beliefs. For Assad, religious activity, so often associated with the faculty of the mind, is better understood as consisting of postures that emerge from repeated bodily practices. This materialist perspective on religion is at the heart of Assad's critique of a European post-Enlightenment approach to religion that would emphasize intellectual and volitional endorsement of a particular God idea. It's also part of Assad's articulation of a rejection of the skepticism about religion as something that's kind of coerced on the autonomous, free-thinking individual. Instead, Assad is just trying to move, religion is, in this materialist understanding, very similar to culture. It's like practiced movements. Despite the effort of scholars such as Assad to shift attention from a religious state of mind, you could say, to a religious state of the body, scholars like Assad nevertheless tend to focus upon religious behaviors and techniques that are transmitted among adepts in relatively rarefied contexts. What I would like to do is take up this very same materialist estimation of religion and bring it to what I believe is its most natural conclusion, namely that the primary site in the cultivation of this aptness of behavior, that's Assad's very beautiful phrase, the aptness of behavior that is a religious behavior, the primary site for that cultivation is the household. The primary procedure for the inculcation of that aptness of behavior is child rearing. Child rearing is a highly stylized procedure through which very concrete cultural and religious forms are forged within the person of the child. Thus, family relations in the household are perhaps the most potent factors in the forging of sensibilities and affiliations that are peculiar to a socio-religious group. Like, if you have children in this room, it's like now's when you get nervous. It's like, oh my God, it was so important. Okay. Why does the cultural specificity of maternal care receive so little attention? I think one possibility is that the effort to make more visible the importance of all these care relationships tend to focus on its absolute necessity for human well-being in a general sense. Like, we live in a society in which those care relationships are either invisible, undervalued, underfunded, you know. So efforts to just bring it front and center so that it can become a priority for policy, government, social policy, there's no time, the luxury of talking about its cultural specificity. It's not the right context in a way. And also, there's a kind of iconography of the mother in which the mother's care really is imagined to be, anyway, very instinctual and kind of universal. So, for example, Winnicott, the psychoanalyst operating in London during World War II, working with kids in the countryside who fled the bombing of the city. So he was, in a very first-hand way, dealing with children traumatized by disruptions in their family life and care relations. He was the first to kind of bring a stronger visibility to the maternal relationship in the field of psychoanalysis and psychology. He was also very popular as a kind of radio personality. People liked his approach. So he was, I don't know, maybe like a Dr. Spock or something of that time. And he is perhaps the most influential 20th century writer and theorist regarding the importance of mothering in human development. He devoted his life's work to the kind of, as I said, timeless pan-cultural role, describing ways in which the mother enables the emergence of the capabilities of the child through simple, intuitive relations. So not mothering of an extraordinary sort. He's kind of famous for introducing this term, the ordinary mother. And he would paint these portraits of the attuned responsiveness of the mother as she performs even the most ordinary acts of mothering. And I think that this phrase, ordinary mother, is intentionally kind of flat, non-romanticized depiction of the mother, trying to make visible this most basic and necessary character of maternal provisions. I almost want to say that my contribution to this discussion, you could say, is maybe just a footnote in that sense, which is that, yes, these are maternal care is absolutely necessary. And yes, it is of this ordinary, everyday quality. I only now would say, and nevertheless, it is extremely culturally specific in how it's administered. And so that the specificity of language and worldviews and sensibilities and belonging, all of these are kind of instilled, brought to life. They animate the child, and they're formed in this context and in this relationship. So what are a few examples? Let's get a little bit concrete. You were very generous in your introduction. Deena, she talks about Deuteronomy. She talks about 19th century Jewish ethnographers. And it is true that I move around quite a bit. Finding these kind of textual artifacts of a relationship and a context that doesn't always leave much in the way of historical record is a bit difficult. One nice example that I'd like to kind of draw upon and just touch upon in a cursory way is the lullaby. Okay? Lullaby is a steady mode of interaction between a child and a caregiver. We could also say this is true about music more broadly. A lullaby conditions the child to the culturally inflected temporal routines of sleeping and waking, as well as to moods that the lullaby carries, its language, its embedded narratives. What more serious school of life, that's a quote from Max Weinreich, who was a Jewish kind of, you could say, cultural historian, anthropologist, linguist, who took Freud's ideas really seriously and wrote about Jewish youth and the importance of the early phases of life in cultural formation. He calls breastfeeding the most serious school of life. And I'm kind of saying lullaby too. What a serious school of life, this sensory surround that is the lullaby. Exposing the child to language, narrative, all in this very trance-like state, which no doubt contributes to the acquisition of the verbal and affective sense. Where are the markings of Jewishness forged, if not in these cradled, multisensory, repetitive experiences? Indeed, the lullaby, as well as the general linguistic surround of the infant, suggests that infancy is far from a pre-linguistic state, as some theorists would have it. Far from pre-linguistic, infants are awash in language from the start and begin to acquire verbal faculties in their earliest developments through this exposure to repeated verbal, musical, and sensory experience. The lullaby is arguably a particularly potent means by which a child acquires stylized human functions. And they have specific cultural content. Often, if sung in the Jewish context, the lullaby might serve as the site in which the child is named as a Jew, placed within a particular social landscape, the market, the study house, the hearth, placed upon an arc of a lifetime trajectory, study, marriage, trade, embedded within collective Jewish narratives of exile and redemption. The lullaby is a mechanism by which the child is named, body parts are named, the child's temporal, spatial, social linguistic pathways identified, the melodies and their affect woven into the person of the child. Now, where can we turn to for records of pre-modern lullabies? Though I think it'd be really interesting to examine modern lullabies for this very, with this very same question. One possibility is Ladino materials. And Ladino materials often include poetry, ballad, and song, and they're collected by modern music and ethnographers, but a lot of times it dates much earlier. And the record of these lullabies testify to the thick cultural character of early child rearing. Biblical and Jewish and liturgical motifs are often woven into Ladino lullabies. So, I mean, it's arguable that even this notion that textual literacy begins with schooling outside the household is in need of revision too, given how much Jewish content is in the kind of lullaby and ballad collection. So I'm going to skip a tiny bit and come to some of the lullabies. So the one that I brought here is so famous, Dorme, dorme, sleep, sleep, O mother's little one. Sleep, sleep, free from worry or grief. Sleep, sleep, free from worry. Listen, my joy, to your mother's words, the words of Shema Israel, las palabras de Shema Israel. Duerme, chico de madre, con hermosura de Shema Israel, con hermosura de Shema Israel, with the beauty of Shema Israel. This lullaby, repetitive and soothing, teaches the phrase Shema Israel to the child, establishes a strong association between sleep and the Shema. And so the lullaby is not just about affect and social formation. You could say it involves an instruction of a more narrative variety. The other example I wanted to just mention is these ballads. In addition to lullabies, we have these other household-based musical storytelling forms like the ballad. These ballads often consist of retellings of biblical stories with departures and enhancements, with the speaker often taking poetic license that bridges the biblical story to the social realities of the storyteller. We have ballads that include retelling of the crossing of the sea, the binding of Isaac, the birth of Moses. Scholar Judith Wax has published and examined many of these materials, and they all contribute to our understanding of the cultural ambiance of the household and the place of music and storytelling in the making of family culture. So we'll just look at one example. It's a ballad called Paro era estrellero. Paro was a stargazer, or someone who was occupied with the stars. The implication is like an astrologer. There is a rabbinic midrash that suggests that it was actually in consultation with the stars that Paro learned that there would be among the Jews someone who would rise up and redeem them. And this is a Ladino retelling, in a way, of that midrash. And the ballad features an infant cradled in this star-filled setting, and it really lent itself well to the lullaby. We learn that Paro was a stargazer who, in gazing upon the stars, foretells the birth of Moses. He sends for the midwives, comadres, and commands that they do not catch the Jewish males. The ballad concludes that the comadres were Jewish, beloved by God. They caught the babies and fled, and so Moses was born. It's notable that this ballad names the midwives as Jews, something that is more ambiguous in the biblical text. In some versions of this ballad, it ends with the making of a basket and the placement of baby Moses on the Nile. The cradled Moses, so suggestive of the context in which this ballad might have been sung, is transposed upon the listening child. How much is transmitted in this telling? Does the listening child not then become baby Moses, positioned against a malevolent Paro, protected by women and destined for greatness? So what's another example of how we see the household and the making of Jewish culture, how it happens? So here's another example, also from the case of the conversos. There was a converso practice, kind of infamous one, a strange one, of varrer a casa a avesas, of sweeping the house in the wrong way. That is, sweeping it towards the inside rather than the outside of the house. This was referred to a lot in kind of anti-converso and anti-Judaizing polemics in the medieval period. And it has no basis in kind of biblical or rabbinic teachings, and is frequently mentioned as proof of the intransient nature of Jewish commitments among the conversos and also the kind of ridiculousness of it. It's ridiculed as a custom because it contradicts even the most basic household sense, still true, of sweeping filth indoors. The impracticality or even foolishness of this custom drew the attention of church polemicists who preached about this odd behavior, as well as the general role of women in the durability of these Jewish commitments during their sermons. In his studies of these polemics, and this is in the 1950s, Edward Glaser found no biblical or rabbinic basis for this custom. In an attempt to explain its origins, a generation later, Yosef Yerushalmi seizes upon an explanation that was offered by a rabbinic authority a few hundreds of years later, Moshe Chagiz, who was a rabbinic figure 1671 to 1750, who suggested that the origin of this rite is to be found in the lingering reverence for the mezuzah among the conversos. That while the converso household would no longer have a mezuzah posted, reverence for the kind of sanctity of that part of the domicile brought them to sweep away from the threshold. I would suggest that Moshe Chagiz's interpretation, which is beautiful, I've actually nothing against the interpretation, but I don't think it accounts for the custom's origin, but is rather a later attribution of meaning. And this has been pointed out already by Renee Melamed, who has a beautiful study about converso life, the role of women in converso practices, Renee Melamed has already noted that the most likely origin of this custom was the effort of the conversas to conceal their housework on Fridays. The origin of sweeping the house on the wrong way was the effort to conceal the fact that they were sweeping it on the wrong day. Housework on Fridays was no less incriminating than the abstention from work on the Sabbath itself. Changing the lamp oil on the wrong day, sweeping the house on the wrong day, spinning thread on the wrong day, were all regarded as signs of Jewishness. These actions indicate the ways in which Jewish temporal structures continued to govern everyday life in the converso household. And household operations of relatively low or even no ceremonial register, sweeping. That's like barely makes it to any kind of, let's say, rabbinic concern. Sweeping, or the foods you cook with, chickpeas, eggplant. I mean, the inquisitional records, blood-stained records of converso behaviors, it's arguable that the most reliable material in the inquisitional dockets is the material that relates to the domestic everyday life. And when those records say things like they lit candles, they baked matzah, I'm not saying they did or didn't. I'm saying that's hard to gauge because those were the signature practices that are listed even in the expulsion document, that are listed when an inquisition would set itself up in a town, they would post it up. Do you know someone who lights the candles, eats the matzah, you know, so that, I mean, those behaviors were no doubt persisting, but it's harder to gauge the reliability of the accusation. Whereas when it starts saying things like eggplant, a particular smell in the kitchen, a habit of stripping the fat off the meat, you know, a beautiful, juicy, fatty piece of meat comes home from the market, and then the woman of the household uses her fingernails to scratch it down. Now, we don't know, is she doing that in compliance with Mosaic law, or is she doing that because she grew up eating lean meat itself, the result of religious law? Or how does one slaughter a chicken the day after a forcible mass conversion? Probably by taking out the slaughter knife that you have, probably by checking the blade that it is smooth, probably by as quick and as painless a cut as possible. Or do we imagine that the household would suddenly kind of look over at how the neighbors do it, try ringing? We know that these household operations, how food is prepared and even how it's slaughtered, are going to persist after conversion. Baptism does a really bad job changing household life. So there's a way in which the converso phenomenon is most revealing of these household mechanisms in the making of Jewish culture. And in the case of sweeping the house indoors, the circumstances that forged this converso custom were forgotten. They were cleaning the house on the wrong day. And it became tethered to the ancient Jewish practice of placing a mezuzah on the doorpost. And it is not my purpose here to critique this later development. Quite the contrary. I enjoy the fact that this is yet another example of the ways in which household operations, the place in which these regularized cultural activities are enacted, make their way into these more textual and prescriptive materials like rabbinic materials. I did allude earlier, and this will be my last kind of bit of content, to the fact that one of the ideas that I include in my thinking about mothers and child rearing and the making of Jewish culture is this notion of constancy as the signature characteristic of the mother. And I often try to look to see where I could find that. Where is there evidence of that constant presence? Because, you know, things that are constant, they're assumed. Like I don't walk around, maybe I should, going, fresh air, took a breath, took another breath. You know, it would be endless to name those constant matters that I'm always relying upon. And in a way, the mother, I kind of think of that as the shorthand for the constant matters that sustain us and that we're kind of asked to assume. You know, we're asked not necessarily to turn back and gaze upon the mother. And maybe that was okay as long as there were broader cultural and religious frameworks in which she was being rendered fully. So there's the visibility of the maternal without each person necessarily having to do all that work of integrating. You know, that's a lot. But we don't have that. Many of the Western religious narratives that organize our public and even private domains are deficient in terms of representations of the mother. So we're sort of on our own in terms of trying to bring more visibility and affirmation to the maternal relation. How can we do that in turning to traditional Jewish texts? And where I think that I've found it in ways that have been rewarding for me is in that Hebrew root of Aleph Mem Nun. That this very central Hebrew root, it's the word for amen. Amen in response to someone's blessing, but also in biblical texts, in Psalms, in the book of Numbers, it appears as a way of saying, yes, what you said, I say it. I affirm fully what you've said. It means to be constantly with. Only later would it come to mean to subscribe to a doctrine, to believe in something. But in biblical materials, almost exclusively, it refers to a relationship of constancy. Mostly it's concerned with the relationship between God and the people of Israel, or the male characters, Moses, Abraham, and their faithfulness. But it also is the term, Aleph Mem Nun, that refers to a custodian of a young child. To be an omen, or an omenet, is to be the caregiver of a young child, so suggestive of this possibility that it was actually that concrete relationship of care and the necessary constant presence of another person for our basic survival that then could enable a more abstract notion of faithfulness. There is no faith in the abstract. It's a learned experience. And then you can begin to kind of imagine faithfulness more generally. And so if Aleph Mem Nun has the M in it, then it's particularly powerful to write the mother into this term because Hebrew letters and words carry meaning far beyond their basic utility as, you know, signifiers of another sense. An important strain of Jewish thought from rabbinic writings onwards considers the very material forms of the Hebrew language to be sacred. The shape of the letters, even the shapes surrounding them, the white fire surrounding the black fire, the crowns upon the letters in the Torah scroll, all of these have meaning. And so to find the mother in these Hebrew letters is to write her back into what is arguably the most sacred of Jewish forms, the Hebrew letters themselves. Indeed, given the aniconic direction that Jewish representation has taken in the last 2 millennia, it's arguable that the Hebrew letters are the last material forms that are permitted this kind of reverence. Thus, the recovery of the maternal valence of these letters is a kind of recovery of the maternal divine, embodied in the letters themselves, and in sounds that bear a close relationship to the primal sound of mother. Encoded in these Hebrew letters is a reference to the early and necessary provision of constant care, the constant presence that is necessary for all human life. I think I will conclude there. Thank you. Thank you.
So we do have some time for questions, if anybody wants to jump in for our speaker. At the back, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. That was like super cool, and I really enjoyed your just description of Amen at the end. I hadn't realized kind of all of the significance there. I was just curious, kind of when we're thinking more broadly, you mentioned the kind of really foundational role that mothers play in, transmitting religion in this kind of caregiving relationship. And I was wondering, you know, what do you think of like the emphasis often on like the male and the masculine as being like associated with religion? And do you think that's actually sort of almost a kind of a response to that, or like I don't know, what do you think is the relationship between those?
Great question. Well, so, you know, first of all, where to begin with that question? There's a way in which I'm hoping to take apart, just to say, first of all, a kind of biodeterministic way of exploring these functions. Functions of caregiving, functions of tending to broader social security, government, and politics, to consider each of these important functions not as kind of, like I said, appropriate for one gender or another, or one biology or another. And yet, as I was saying with Mara Benjamin, there is such a strong association between this care relationship and women and mothers. Still, nevertheless, I try to get at some of the core characteristics of that relationship, and it does seem to me that constancy and constant presence is perhaps a defining characteristic of what it is to mother someone, to be an omen. You're asking, what about the fact that often, then here I am saying that it's in the context of that relationship that religion happens. You're saying, okay, let's just talk about the fact that often, typically, people think of matters of religion, they think of institutions, not the household. So the shorthand there might be synagogue or church or mosque. You know, that's where religion happens. So part of what we're doing here, and this is, again, spatiality and Charlotte's work, is kind of broadening our understanding of a landscape that is a religious and cultural landscape. Even the term synagogue needs to be revised. And because sometimes synagogue often appears as the pairing with household. So if household is family, relationships, vernacular, everyday life, synagogue is where kind of elite, maybe rabbinic things happen and associated with men. But then when you look at the synagogue and you start to, especially its early history, and you start to see that the synagogue was a place of assembly that had a very long life before it became a rabbinic institution, where it was host to hospitality, meals. Josephus describes how people would gather in the synagogues to debate whether and how to participate in the great revolt against Rome. New Testament literature describes Jesus visiting synagogues and the kind of enactments and healing enactments that would take place in the assembly. It was basically, in a way, it's a collection of households. It's an assembly. Its vernacular aspect is very strong. You have even certain rabbinic texts writing against the fact that the synagogue has this vernacular aspect, that people call the Aron HaKodesh, rather than calling it Aron HaKodesh, its lofty formal rabbinic name apparently, they call it the Arna, the Aron, the Ark, in the vernacular Aramaic. And that is very upsetting. Or they don't call it Beit Knesset, the formal term for synagogue, place of assembly, they call it Beit Am. Much more egalitarian sound to it. So even what is typically in this binary that's sort of thrown onto the other side of male elite formations, in there you can find the place of meeting our everyday needs of sociality and assembly. So that's, I guess, a little bit of an approach to a very big question.
I found this incredible. I really appreciated how you started by framing the sort of household as explaining continuity throughout time. And I want to ask about continuity and discontinuity across space, because as we're moving into a more embodied and more sort of habitus model of religion, the differences, particularly among different groups of Jews in the diaspora, become more relevant, right? Like the language in which the lullabies are sung, the foods that are eaten at home. And when it was interesting to me that when you reached in the lullaby for a sort of example of the Jewish content that is contained in that lullaby, it was the Shema, right? It was the Hebrew prayer. And so I have this almost anxiety about these very different households that are not identifiably part of the same culture, except that the thing that brings them together is then the set of texts that, like, you know, all the boys, because it was, you know, for most of history, the boys then go and they learn the same Torah and they learn the same Talmud, but that's the only way that you can tell that someone, you know, speaking Ladino and someone speaking Yiddish are part of the same culture. And that obviously has political ramifications. I'm thinking of, you know, the early Zionist project of like revitalizing Hebrew as a vernacular precisely because it was conceived of as the universal. But just thinking about, if we move into thinking of the household as the center of religious life, does that reveal differences across Jewish culture that make, or Jewish cultures, that make seeing a singular Judaism at any given time more difficult?
Both of these questions, I'm like, I want to come teach at Stanford. Yay! These are fantastic. Definitely more observation than question, both of you. And I'm also wanting to pick Charlotte's brain in response to this question, but I will say, yes, this approach will now assume tremendous varieties of Jewish expression. Then you ask the difficult question, well then what is the organizing principle that links them one to the other, and are you going to have to fall back on Torah text and for the most part Talmud? You know, the section I have here, so anytime historians are sitting down, you know, trying to write the history of the Jews, you know, they have to contend with all of the rupture, and then they also have to try to account for the continuity. And, you know, I think Michael Fishbane wrote a very short volume called Judaism, Revelation, and Traditions ages ago. And he's trying to kind of do that dance, and he argues that he calls it, there's some features, kind of some constant features, and he's trying to move away from there isn't a constant essence, but there are features. And there have been times where I have thought maybe we could identify some constant features. I'm not going to hem my head. Constant features. Sabbath, presence of Hebrew language either as art form, so as icon, or as kind of used as language in the normal sense. Shia Cohen, in his book Maccabees to the Mishnah, okay, he's trying to write a pretty lengthy history there. He ends up, when he's trying to figure out what's the links between pre-exilic Israel and Second Temple Judaism, he suggests it is, quote, the perception of continuity. I was like, that's not fair. Then you have to answer what feeds that perception of continuity. But what he says is that the most potent force that unifies ancient Israel and Second Temple Judaism is the self-definition as such. So that, and this is his language, despite the absence of, quote, actual continuities, nevertheless, somehow there was a perception of continuity that persists there. Yerushalmi does the same thing when he's trying to figure out the conversos. What could possibly account for the fact that generations later, you know, somebody emerges in the Ottoman context and, rejoins the Jewish community? Where did that come from, despite the, quote, absence of actual religious Jewish experience? So I felt like both Shia Cohen and Yerushalmi in their own way would have benefited. It's not that my material troubles their claim, it's just that they end up talking about it in these very mysterious ways, perceptions and ethno-religious imprints. Okay, that's what people are trying to figure out. What could explain the continuity? But if you, again, try, look and see whether the household is a mechanism by which some of these things are persisting, then perhaps, now I'll come back to your thing, is this where a sense of common history, kind of mythic history, and maybe even a gesture towards future destinations? Like that's where the inscription happens, possibly. I mean, and I don't want to, Daniel Boyarin, is someone who's out there still today, right now, trying to say that Jews are not a religion in the abstract, but they are a people in body. He's been using blood language, but he doesn't mean kind of blood in some race definition. He means these family constructs, and he draws upon a legal theorist named Patricia Williams, who was herself reflecting on what constitutes African American peoplehood. And she suggested that it's early habits that make her who she is, rather than genetics or some kind of biological determinism. It's some kind of, she calls it, the inheritance of linguistically and rhetorically embedded traditions that are passed on in habits of speech. And she's very beautifully says this phrase, we are talked into the world by our forebearers. Quote, their accented soundscape is the familiarity through which we filter all experience. So I really took this up, that we are talked into the world by our forebearers, to think that something similar is operating in terms of Jewish formations.
So thank you so much. This, I've never heard anyone speak on this before. I mean, we hear so much about Jewish mothers, and so it's nice to bring it to an academic level. I mean, I have so many outrageous and what I think are strange thoughts right now, but it was some of to comment on the lullabies and the allusion to some of the more religious aspects of them. I mean, and do what you want with this, and I don't know, this might be irreverent in some way. But the first one I thought of was Dona Dona, which is not really a lullaby, 3/4 times, but still a song. And so, and also, of course, Virginicus with Mondlane, which are both have to do with slaughter. So, and as fairy tales and some childhood things will go in a very kind of existentially negative type of way. So I wanted your take on that. Any comment, and slaughtering obviously was one of the temple acts, right?
Right.
So there's that. I know it's a crazy thing. Right? Yeah. But and then of course there is the Wilbur Freud, who came later, and the idea of the things starting, the kind of neuroses starting with in the home with the mother. I mean, these are the thoughts that are coming right. So anyway, I'll just keep it on those two.
I think I'll just say there's someone named Sarah Yafet, who is a kind of an ethnomusicologist who has been collecting Jewish lullabies. And it very much sits right in the question you asked. I listened once to a CD of them. They were so wildly different one from the other, the Jews in Tunisia and the Jews from, the Greek speaking, Ottoman context. And it was very difficult to identify anything that is Jewish lullaby. Just as it's difficult to identify what is lullaby, though there are efforts to say, well, lullaby is, here's the definition, if it's used in order to soothe a child towards sleep. So there needs to be mention of sleep. That was, Sarah Yafet said to me, that's one of her criteria. There has to be a mention of sleep. And yes, do these stories mark the child? Yes, just like the dark imagery of some of the kind of English language lullabies that are familiar to most of us have often this terrifying imagery. So yeah, it's really interesting. And in the case of naming of the child as a Yingele, in that Yiddish one, that the child is named as a Jew, in that context is really interesting, given that, I mean, Cynthia Baker, in her book called The Jew, talks about Jew as something that sort of comes at you from the outside. And then, but when you think about the lullabies and how they name the child and place the child in a Jewish historical and kind of spatial situation, you know, maybe the naming happens in a more interior way. So.
I was just going to ask, another thing that occurred to me that I know about your lecture that I thought was really interesting was how you emphasized how a lot of these like family structures have changed really drastically in modern times. You know, that kind of emergence of like dyadic family relationships that don't have that kind of extended family, or might not have, let's say, you know, you can have just a sole mother-child relationship. But also that like lullabies, for example, I'd be super curious about how a lot of oral culture has shifted, you know, with the emergence of technology, and I think really drastically we've lost a lot of that. And so I was just wondering, you know, like what does this lead you to reflect about the modern era, about modern Jewish identity? You know, how has this changed, like what is being a Jew in kind of modern times because of this change in the relationship?
I think I'll just, so yeah, my project, right, my project emerged when I myself became a mother and witnessed the role of the household ambiance in the making of my child. It's a very intense thing to realize the importance of that. And then also I became really aware of the deficiency of the modern nuclear family in providing what was typically provided for in a much more culturally thick and well-populated environment. No naps yesterday, right? It's crazy. Okay, so yes, there are deficiencies in the modern post-industrial nuclear family arrangement, including, as I was just sharing with Shana, that we are only a few generations into maybe this most major experiment in human history, which is this is the first time that human infants are received into a household not inhabited by someone who has already raised a child. Okay, from like a human species perspective, that is foolishness. I mean, our wellness is fully corresponds to the degree to which we are receiving inherited, receiving traditions about how to do stuff. So the baby comes into the arms of someone who's never before, often mothered a child, and not even necessarily with access to someone who has. So the uncertainties, the anxieties, the unknowns, and then the deficiencies in the culture that's meant to provide that sensory surround. And so I guess I would say from a more optimistic level, which is if we recognize that these are deficient social arrangements, then we can start to address it, supplement it as much as possible. And this is where I think religion has such a positive role to play, especially religion as defined in this way. You know, so much ugly things are happening in the name of religion, but religion in this more, these cultural definitions where it's just the stuff that makes us people and enables connection, communication, the making of meaning, satisfaction in life. Religions, especially of some vintage, often have within them a lot of the kind of medicines for the human condition. So I always say to people, if you have any access to any tradition or religion of pre-modern vintage, hold on to it And then if you're going to be raising kids in any formation, summon it because it'll have the stuff of life in it. So.
Well, that seems like a wonderfully hopeful sort of note on which to end this year's David Lobel lecture. Would you please join me in applauding?
Oh, thank you. Thank you.